Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with another Game Week 13 cheat sheet preview. If you're new to the series, basically a continuously updating spreadsheet that changes on a week-to-week basis, looking at historic stats over the course of the season, my eye test as well as things have developed, anticipating how players will do in the next few fixtures, and how I think they've been developing, on a personal level. If we actually move straight to the defenders, though, this week there really hasn't been much movement in my opinion. I think the largest impact will be the Chilwell injury that we'll discuss in a quick second. But Tsimikas has been added as a differential. He, of course, did feature in the match versus Arsenal, and if you still had Tsimikas in your team, you would have probably earned a clean sheet. The main issue with Tsimikas is nothing to do with Tsimikas himself. I think he's extremely high value for money as a defender, even if he doesn't play many games, because when you actually play Tsimikas, the value that you get back for him as a 3.9 piece is astronomical. The only thing is, I just think that your money is probably better well spent having a third Liverpool player in Jota. I think Jota ranks extremely highly in these kind of offensive statistics. You don't even have to divide it by a per 90 basis. Jota actually outperforms a lot of players who have had much more minutes than he has had this season, and it shows you how interesting Jota is as a midfield piece. For that reason, I think Tsimikas has to kind of stay as a differential because Jota clearly is the better option to have as a third Liverpool piece. I expect all of us to have Trent and Salah as essential pieces. I don't really expect that to change. If for some reason you think that Tsimikas can replace Trent, that's maybe possible. I would still say it's much safer to go with Trent. He's not rotatable. He also has the impact of the additional set piece kind of action, such as free kick goals and things like that. Whereas Tsimikas, I actually think can be a fantastic assistive piece, but the goals are probably what will kind of differentiate Trent alongside the minutes. 4.5 plus, I would say that it's a bit of respect from me given to Dyer. I think he definitely will stay within this back three of Conte, in my opinion. I think he will stay within this side and actually establish himself as a top player in this team. However, Dyer still kind of falls with the same kind of centre-back conundrum where he's probably quite reliant on goals from set pieces, and I don't really see Dyer scoring too many of those. The other kind of option is through bonus points and clean sheets, which is possible if we think that Spurs will eventually reach a point where they become a very defensively solid team, similar to how we envision someone like Ben White being a solid fourth piece this season. Of course, now that we've actually moved into a lot of lineups where we have maybe two Chelsea fullbacks, Cancelo and Trent, it's increasingly harder to kind of justify maybe owning a 4.5 player when you could easily go for a back five, stretch it to someone like Reguilon, who's another fullback that can produce and will benefit from all the kind of defensive numbers that Dyer would usually benefit from. Dyer, the only kind of difference maker that he has individually is going to be those three kicks, and ultimately I don't think you can rely on free kick goals from a centre back, so that's why he only sits in that kind of category. With Wolves and Wolves defender, I would say that they're a team that we've definitely kind of omitted from our minds. I'm sure a lot of people still own Sa as a differential keeper, but I, for one, am a player who owns Cody in the team. I haven't really found a way to take him out of my team. Ideally, he probably goes for James in the near future or gets moved on for someone like Alonso. But the next 2 weeks for Wolves are fantastic, and we just saw them get a clean sheet versus West Ham, which was very, very, very nice to see. This also, once again, raises the question of whether we keep someone like Cody in the team, especially since defender transfers are so frowned upon. I just think that you would ideally keep all your Wolves players until after the Burnley game and make a decision after that. I'm probably going to play Cody both of those games, and it just shows why Wolves defenders have kind of risen in priority recently. I've also given Reguilon and Emerson a rise. I've added Emerson to the list. It's clear that both Emerson and Reguilon are now in attacking phases, at least positioning themselves much higher up than before. Whether or not they actually provide enough production for me is a good question, because I think when you look at Reguilon's goal, it came off of a set piece, and I would actually say that the involvement from Reguilon and Emerson in open play hasn't been significant enough, and that actually calls into question for me their value for money, even though they're still at a quite cheap price. When we look at, for example, a comparison like Alonso at 5.6, who plays for this Chelsea side, and we know for sure will be playing much more offensive positions, getting into the box a lot more, creating these kind of direct shots on target, even providing through, let's say, corners and things like that. I just think that Reguilon and Emerson fall short, and not to mention there's going to be a defensive difference as well. This Tottenham side will take a few weeks, in my opinion, to gel. We've seen that with Conte sides where it takes a while for him to actually establish the correct tactical structure that he wants to implement, even though he's been quite set in stone with different variants of the three-back in the last few years. We've seen, for example, different centre-backs kind of rotated within the lineup, Tanganga being played last week, Ben Davies kind of being inserted to the lineup recently. So those kind of things will, in my opinion, change how effective this defense is. Usually what happens is when a manager comes in, they will find a kind of defined backline that they like, and then changes can be made once the tactical structure is developed. And we kind of saw that last season with Chelsea, and this season where much more defenders are kind of in and out of the rotation and able to contribute. I just think it will take a bit of time there, and perhaps we shouldn't be so high on Reguilon and Emerson the same way we really shouldn't have in retrospect been so high on Kane and Son as an example. Just before I continue with the midfielders, I'd love to shout out OneFootball. OneFootball are a fantastic football app that I actually use personally to cater all my football preferences and kind of interests into one place. You can download the apps with a QR code or the link in the description below if you're an Android or an Android user, and I personally use it to follow as many leagues as possible, most of the kind of top domestic European leagues, as well as the Champions League when I'm ever actually missing the games on a weekday night. So for me, it's an easy way to actually check, what the lineups are, who scored goals, who scored assists, who actually people think are the man of the match, maybe even updates in terms of tickers, so kind of live commentary feeds as well, and getting a feel for what's going to happen over the course of the week if, let's say, I've missed out specific injury news and things like that. I also, for example, follow my team Real Madrid on a kind of weekly basis. I get notifications, and I can also turn them off if I want, but I use it to pretty much follow my team on a weekly basis. So please check out the app in the link in the description below. With Mings and Cash, I think they certainly benefit from this kind of new manager bounce, and Gerrard seems to be a very competent manager. I have no kind of worries about what he's able to do. The question for Mings, of course, is that once again he falls with the same conundrum for centre-backs. He does seem to be a much more significant set-piece threat than someone like Dyer. For me, he's probably one of the biggest set-piece threats in the league, alongside someone like Gabriel, who's a very physical player, or Van Dijk, or even Dunk as an example, or even Duffy. So he has some kind of interest there. The issue with players like that is you can't really guarantee when they're going to score from a set piece, right? It's kind of like, Liverpool kind of getting destroyed by West Ham through set pieces as well. You can't really anticipate the right games. You might be benching them for the wrong games. Whereas someone like Cash, you expect these fullbacks to probably deliver on the easier games. Cash, for example, was someone who hauled versus Everton, scored a goal by kind of dismissing Dean quite easily. And scoring a solo goal in the process. I imagine Cash will be the more attacking player when you compare what the options are on the left. But it will take a bit of time, I think, for him to be established as a player, and for Gerrard to kind of establish a system where Cash has the kind of space to move forwards. And that will first have to require, I think, Aston Villa to establish the defensive identity first. When we look into Alonso, Chilwell, and James, of course, we're very much dismayed as Chilwell owners by the Chilwell injury, but I think it just calls for a simple move to Alonso. I really think downgrading to Reguilon is probably not the right option. I really think that, over the course of the season, we have to be working our way towards getting the two Chelsea fullbacks if we don't have it already. I'm sure when I talk about the top 10k, you'll see that most of the owners there actually do have both Chelsea defenders, and a lot of them will probably be making side grades to Alonso this week, and that will also provide them with an additional kind of budget flexibility. So for me, Alonso is a little bit of a simple option to make, especially with the kind of news from Matt Law kind of predicting that Chilwell's injury will probably make him miss out most of the season, or at least have it be revisited by the New Year time. And when we actually look at the fixture schedule, you'll know that is enough time for Alonso to provide enough value for money in your team. Of course, if you own Rudiger already, I don't really see the need to move to someone like Alonso. Rudiger still seems interesting. Of course, Rudiger is once again probably more reliant on set pieces, but we know he's been an extremely physical threat. I don't really see any reason to move Rudiger out of your team unless it's to go into someone like Trent or Cancelo, which is a justifiable move if you already have someone like James and Alonso in the team. I was also recently asked about whether or not I'd like to own 3 Chelsea defenders, and to be honest, my answer might actually be I wouldn't be opposed to it as long as you play a back 5. Once again, I still think Trent and Cancelo are absolute essentials at this point in time, and there's no reason to move away from them. But if you want to play with a back 5, I think you're completely justified to do so, especially since we've observed that the forwards have been so poor this season. Cresswell conversely falls, just because I think we've seen West Ham slip up in some games. especially from a defensive point of view, even though their actual overall defensive numbers are good. I just think that we just can't get enough guarantees for them to dominate games, even if we expect them to do well and perform well on the table. They've usually been winning games where both teams have scored. So from that kind of point of view, I think Cresswell is just a little bit less interesting. Most of his kind of assists are from set pieces, and there's much less guarantees there, especially when the Chelsea options are there, and will probably post much more points through clean sheets over the course of the season, which will edge out someone like Cresswell. And that's pretty much how I feel about the defenders. Right, so let's go into the midfielders. In terms of midfielders, I actually think that the time has come and gone for Mbeumo. We've seen enough games, we've given him enough easy fixtures where it really just doesn't, or who really doesn't justify a place in our team anymore. I think he clearly has to be transferred out as soon as possible to someone like Smith Rowe or Gallagher. Even though Smith Rowe's fixtures are getting a little bit tough, Gallagher clearly seems to be the most logical option around this price range, and for me, has the fixtures and is justified enough because we've seen enough talismanic performances from him to say that he's a very, very strong pick to have. Whereas with Mbeumo, despite the fact that he's playing out of position, we just haven't really seen enough in terms of returns. Yes, we've seen more shots to the post, but I just don't think it's enough. I'd rather honestly own Tony at this point in time. I personally own Tony, so that's a little bit biased perhaps, but that's just my kind of assessment based on things. And the fact that Tony is, undroppable in a sense, also changes things because Mbeumo is someone who's prone to being subbed off, maybe if he's having a poor game earlier on than Tony. Gray as well has to go, and unfortunately it just comes down to the fact that this Everton side have just been very, very depleted from an injuries point of view. Also haven't offered much from a footballing point of view since their kind of very initial good start. Cornet in the 6.1 to 6.7 territory is the only person who really receives a deserved rise. I've also risen Sarr, but I will speak about him preemptively. I also think he's got some injury issues, so we'll have to discuss that. But with Cornet, I think he's an incredibly interesting option, even in this game week, because we've seen that this Tottenham backline have been quite susceptible. I think playing versus Everton was a bit of a kind of non-factor because we know this Everton side have been very, very poor as of late, whereas when we actually look at someone like Cornet, we've seen this Burnley side improve a lot, I think, in terms of goal creation and chance creation since Cornet has been inserted into the team and since they've actually implemented him in increasingly more attacking positions to the point where he now plays basically as a dual striker option alongside Wood. He, of course, does get subbed quite often with Vidra, but I really don't think that's a huge issue. We've seen that Burnley have been able to trounce and also explode on teams, especially in the mid-table. And I do think Tottenham have a mid-table defense that can be exploited right now. As I said, Tottenham's defense is continuously rotating, and they will still have to find some time before they actually establish the correct defensive structure and personnel that they like to play with. So for me, this is still a good time to have Cornet playing versus Tottenham. And I also really enjoy the fixtures that he has after that. Not only that, but the fact that he is basically a 2 to 3% ownership player means that he can provide a massive differential to most teams in the league. And I have no issues with people who want to go into Cornet, especially since Rafinha's fixtures are getting slightly worse. And we're just seeing much less value from money from most of these players, with exception to maybe Bowen, who becomes an interesting maybe transition away from Cornet in a few weeks' time. Sarr I've given a rise just because I think Watford have been a little bit more interesting than anticipated. He's clearly only a differential at this point in time because the Watford fixtures are very, very poor. Hopefully his injury issues will be kind of resolved in a few weeks' time when Watford actually have a very nice run post the kind of madness of fixtures recently. Because if you actually look at their fixtures now, incredibly tough. No reason to really think about Sarr now, but clearly just an option to think about in a few weeks' time when we maybe look at replacements from Rafinha and Cornet. In the 6.9 to 7.7 territory, I'd really like to make this discussion exclusively about Jota and Bernardo Silva. For me, Jota, with the exception to maybe whatever injury issues that could come up, I think he looks completely fine. He was on the bench versus Porto. He was also seen in training, so that seems to be great. I think Jota clearly is the priority midfield pick for most managers. We've seen this season that I think the Liverpool attack cannot be doubted. We've also seen Jota look incredibly well, with the exception to the tap-in that he missed earlier on in the season, but we've seen composure as well being exhibited by him, for example, in the Arsenal game when he was able to kind of dispatch both Ramsdale and the Arsenal defense in turn. Bernardo Silva is someone who has to rise this week because I think he's a perfect hedge to Foden, and especially with the impact of the Foden injury and the Grealish injuries, you will have to say that Bernardo probably is going to start most of these games during the December period. We know he usually doesn't have any fitness issues. It seems like Pep also likes to rest him a little bit for the UCL because he's seen as a priority option. But this City side is much improved with Bernardo Silva coming in. Even though the underlying stats aren't as beautiful as Foden's, he falls quite a bit short in terms of expected goals. He still is really up there in terms of expected assists. And I just think his movement and his positioning in terms of looking for kind of loose balls has really improved this season. So that's why we've actually seen him kind of get these nice tap-in goals, because he's actually collecting rebounds and actually anticipating movement, trying to actually move into goal-scoring positions, similar to the way Gundogan did in the previous season when he was in extremely hot form. I think this is a fantastic kind of period to own Bernardo Silva if you, let's say, don't own Foden or want something to hedge Foden with. If you're actually looking at the 7.9 players, I just think there's not much difference in terms of movements. I think Foden is someone I would still like to keep, ideally, as long as his injury concern isn't large. It really depends on whatever Pep says about that. Havertz, for me, has to fall, though, because I think even though he's looked okay from a positional point of view, in terms of getting into attacking positions, in terms of servicing some of his Chelsea teammates, he just hasn't been explosive enough as an asset. And that was kind of the criticism that we had raised early on in the season when we were thinking about Havertz and him being technically out of position as a midfielder. Even though Lukaku hasn't found his way back into the team, I just think Havertz has been performing enough in these nice fixtures for him to be justified and to be kept around the team. We know the fixtures are going to get slightly tougher for Chelsea at this point in time, and there's no real reason to own Havertz, especially when the pivot to Jota is so free and gives you this kind of budget flexibility. Mane is someone who have risen. The only issue with Mane is just the fact that I think Jota should be your third Liverpool player. He obviously offers a lot more money and kind of cash benefits in a sense. But I can't dismiss the fact that I think Mane is basically delivering a fantastic season this year. He clearly looks in form, maybe just as in form as Salah, who has slightly kind of reduced his level of impact, I think, in recent games, and Mane has been quite explosive as of late, so that's why he's risen. Salah clearly is, of course, the best option in the league. I'm not dismissing that whatsoever because of the impact of the penalties and also the assistive elements, but we've seen that Mane has looked incredibly good in the last few weeks, and I think he will definitely find his place in the side, and Firmino will probably take some time to actually get back into full fitness. If we look into the forwards, this is actually where we've had an incredible amount of movement. Pukki is someone who's risen. I mentioned him on Twitter as someone who would be interesting as an option for Norwich, especially due to the impact of the Dean Smith signing. The fact that he actually scored on Dean Smith's debut game is a very good sign. Norwich's fixtures are still all right. But Pukki, I think, still is actually quite expensive. When we compare it to someone like King, though, or even Dennis, I think those two pose as very interesting kind of alternative options and probably seem to still be a better side than Norwich, I think, from a personnel basis. Definitely on an attacking end, I think King's underlying stats look extremely good compared to some of the kind of peers here in this kind of price range. King, for me, is someone who will look extremely good when Watford's tough run of fixtures end. And it's not a bad time now to actually anticipate getting King because Dennis will be involved in the African Cup of Nations. And that will obviously mean that King will be the talisman at that point in time. In the structure, I think he's also become more of a talisman compared to Sarr. So that is the kind of improvement of having King in the side. I think that Ranieri is getting Watford to at least play some better attacking football. We've seen them be able to threaten teams a lot more and create a lot more chances, and that's the kind of benefit of Watford. Even though they're not a very, very consistent team, we've seen them also be shut out conversely, just like they did when Cucho was still a manager. Broja is someone who has to fall, and the direct reason for his fall is linked with the person just below his name in Armstrong. Armstrong, of course, was playing when Broja was injured, and he's basically found a way to get an assist or a goal in each game since Broja's absence, and that probably means that Hassan Hutel will stay within the structure, which makes Armstrong rise for me. And Southampton have actually once again developed a nice little neat partnership between Adams and Armstrong. Armstrong obviously being at that cheaper price makes him very good value for money at this point in time, and that's why he rises. Tony is someone who's also risen as well. Just like the reason I've given for Mbumo falling, Tony rises because he's finally got in a haul. He still actually has some rather nice games in the near future, and for that reason I think he deserves a rise. You'd hope that he'd be a little bit more explosive. The underlying numbers aren't fantastic for Tony, but I do expect him to get along rather nicely in this period as long as Brentford look to be in okay form. We don't really want to see games like the Burnley game. If that's the case, then I think we might have to move on Tony sooner than later. But at this moment in time, I'm a little bit cautiously optimistic about what he's able to do over the next few weeks. But Benteke probably is the most interesting kind of differential at this point in time. and at this price point. For me, Benteke is someone who clearly I think will hold down the starting position quite a bit. It was kind of a question amongst kind of FPL managers and their minds in terms of whether Edouard would be able to displace Benteke, but I don't think that's been the case. Not only that, but I think Benteke has been slowly improving in form over the last 2 years. We saw a massive dip, I think, over maybe him leaving Liverpool and his inability rather to pick up form. But in Roy Hodgson's last season, I actually think Benteke managed to score a few more goals than he did in the past. He's always been someone who in the last few years has been underselling his underlying statistics, hasn't been able to kind of dominate in the air as we actually thought he would. But this season, I think he's slowly improved. Still isn't the most clinical player in my opinion, but the brace last week is a very comforting sign. And I think the fact that Crystal Palace are now building much more chances than in the past, playing much more progressive attacking football, maybe allowing Benteke to get more touches and get more confidence will probably mean that he's a very good differential, especially since Crystal Palace's fixtures are very nice. Saint-Maximin is someone who also rises to a differential. He was someone that was not very interesting near the end of the tenure of Steve Bruce, but maybe under Eddie Howe things will change. I will have to say that we have to preface that by saying that we still need much more game time to see exactly what the impact of Eddie Howe's kind of oncoming to Newcastle would be, and maybe Saint-Maximin will continue to be this talismanic piece as he was in the previous game, but we still need just more data. I also still think that Wilson is clearly the focal point of the offense, but it just means that he can also take away options from Saint-Maximin who might be freed up a little bit more. Previously, we were kind of relying on Saint-Maximin to be a much more creative threat, but a 1-goal, 1-assist game does change things because that was something that we didn't envision him to be, someone who would be explosive on a game-to-game basis. And it really comes down to the fact that Newcastle just weren't building enough chances on a per-game basis. So if they're able to do that and their attacking numbers and their kind of creation starts to increase, then I definitely think Saint-Maximin will be a great option going forwards. Edouard falls for the same reason why Benteke rises. Benteke clearly has been informed, locking down that position, whereas Edouard just hasn't had the kind of minutes to shine, and potentially I think he clearly is, below Benteke in the pecking order in Vieira's mind. Antonio falls just due to the impact of not only his kind of recent dip in form, just in terms of actual hauls, when West Ham even have been doing well in some games, but also just the fact that the next few games are still incredibly tough. We have City, Chelsea, Arsenal. Yes, Antonio can actually score in a myriad of ways, but we haven't seen him do that actually versus some weaker teams, and I don't think there's a justification to say that he'll definitely do that versus the teams ahead. Jimenez conversely gets to play versus Norwich and Burnley, which is a very, very nice set of fixtures for him. And I've actually risen Watkins because his offensive stats have actually been on a bit of an upsurge, and it's clear that he's probably going to be that focal point for this Aston Villa offense. So for me, Watkins is definitely one to look at, especially if the new manager bounce and the impact will be sustainable over the next few weeks. And maybe we can consider Watkins as a very good pivot away from Antonio if we don't want to move away from forwards. I still think that Antonio is someone who you could definitely offset to actually move surplus kind of funds into the defense, but that remains to be seen, and we'll see what happens there. Bamford have fallen just because of the injury impacts. Maybe when he comes back, he'll be interesting. The same with Dominic Calvert-Lewin, but they're still both in this list for now as people to consider. And we hope they return soon so that they can actually once again provide some very good attacking developments and kind of change things up in terms of the forwards. Jesus for me falls just due to the impact of his price. I still think he's a little bit overpriced when we consider him to be a forward, someone who's not going to be accessible to clean sheet points and things like that. So for me, what I would say is that Jesus is someone who has to fall, especially when you say that Bernardo Silva is around 7.1. And Foden even is at a cheaper price, even though he might have some injury impacts. So that's kind of how I feel about things right now. Jesus is still a very good player. He's someone who still, I think, will get a lot of minutes in the Premier League. But at this moment in time, I just think that the not so guaranteed minutes and the impact of also the other prices of the competitors in terms of Man City midfield means that Jesus falls. In terms of the goalkeepers, I think I've just given a rise to Foster just due to, honestly, the improvement, I think, in terms of Watford's defense in some individual games and also his kind of own impacts as a goalkeeper in the last few weeks. Of course, things like a penalty save are unsustainable in terms of a consistent way to get points, but it's nice to actually see that Watford were able to shut out Man United for the most part in the previous game, and at least Foster was able to get several key points. I still think the fixture is getting tough for Foster, but there probably is going to be periods after the next 3 games that are really tough for Watford where we consider Foster as a good option to actually start, and people for some reason decided to go Foster versus United, and it was a very smart decision. But it remains to be seen whether it makes sense to actually play him over players like Ramsdale, Sanchez, and Guaita. For me, I think Sanchez, Guaita, and McCarthy are still those kind of three options that are interesting, especially if, let's say, we move out from Livramento. McCarthy could be an interesting option to own it as a kind of differential keeper. But I think from the eye test, I think McCarthy is definitely the weakest keeper out of the four here. He's much less pronounced in terms of his ability to distribute the ball. And if you actually were watching the Southampton game versus Norwich, you'll know what I mean when I say he doesn't meet the eye test whatsoever. Mendy and Martinez are people who definitely do. I also have to kind of give respect to first the new manager bounce from Aston Villa, and also the genuine impact that Mendy has had on this Chelsea defense, even in games where they've struggled. I think where they've faced a lot of shots on target, he's really bailed them out and managed to get some fantastic clean sheets, and he definitely seems to be a slightly better option than Alisson Ederson, just because I think Alisson is probably more prone to losing his clean sheet, and Ederson, conversely, is less prone to actually facing shots. So Mendy is kind of at that kind of phase where he's somewhat in the middle, where I think he gets similar amounts of clean sheets as Ederson, but also gets more shots on target, similar to Alisson. So he's kind of the best of both worlds, in my opinion, and that's how I see things. Whether or not you actually want to own Mendy over, let's say, someone like maybe just going for Rudiger, if you actually want to go for a crazy Chelsea back three, is up to you, but that's how I see things right now. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys very soon.